Story 1. Something in the Attic. Back in the day when I was a kid, there was an old abandoned house at the end of the road. People said it used to belong to Miss Hattie, an old loner who had a thing for weird-looking wind chimes and had sadly died in the house alone. In the years after her passing, the house stood on its own, rotting and decaying. It was untouched for the better part of a decade, and nobody dared to go near it. My friend Jamie, with his knack for trouble, had always had his eye on that house, and constantly pressured me to go into it with him. The house, or I guess I should say what was left of it, was dark and creepy, and so I always rejected the idea, until one day I didn't. On a late summer day, Jamie came over with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "Let's go check out the old abandoned house," he said, with a look that seemed to expect that I'd say no. After a few moments of contemplation, I gave a slight smile and said, "Let's do it." The shock on Jamie's face said it all. Swinging around to the back, we forced open the stubborn back door. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. The wallpaper, once no doubt an array of vibrant colors, now hung in tattered strips, its faded florals suffocated by the creeping mold that clung to them like a sickness. The carpet squelched beneath our feet, a saturated mass that held disgusting rot. Each room we entered was a passageway to neglect, and the floors were speckled with the droppings of rodents that had long claimed this place as their own. Cobwebs laced from corner to corner, and the air was almost unbreathable. It was as if the house itself was grieving. Even with all the signs of years of abandonment, however, I couldn't help but feel that someone had been there recently. "Let's hit the upstairs," Jamie suggested. Hesitantly, I agreed. As we made our way up the staircase, it creaked and popped, announcing our ascent to anyone, or anything, that might be listening. The upstairs felt like walking into a time capsule. Miss Hattie's room was unmistakable, with a solemn portrait hanging above the mantel. Her gaze followed us, unsmiling, ever present. We pushed further, quietly, as if we were trying to avoid waking the dead. Then Jamie, who had this way of pushing just a little too far, said, "Bet you won't go up to the attic." I remember thinking to myself, we'd gone this far, might as well go all the way. It was a decision I'd come to regret. The attic ladder's squeak echoed throughout the house as we pulled it down. Climbing those steps felt like ascending into a mouth of darkness. The attic was a narrow, claustrophobic space, filled with the remnants of a life abandoned. There was a smell, too, an overpowering smell that was an assault, a physical presence that wrapped around me, thick and suffocating. My flashlight flickered to life, cutting through the blackness with an unsteady beam. There was the usual, dusty boxes, unused furniture, and all kinds of other knickknacks. As I scanned around the room, though, I got that uneasy feeling that I had gotten earlier when we first entered the abandoned home, the feeling that someone had recently been there. Slowly I pivoted, my heart pounding in my chest as the grotesque smell of something continued to overpower me to the breaking point. Below, on the floorboards, I could see where the dust had been disturbed, as if to indicate that someone had been walking around in the attic. The beam of my light slowly followed the disturbances on the floor, and led me to the darkest corner of the room. It was there that something greeted me. It was something out of the most twisted horror story that any human could ever conjure up. There, in the far corner, were 4 dead cats. One of them was almost whole, its fur matted, its dead eyes staring into nothingness. The others were in various states of decomposition. The entire scene was a grotesque display of decay and rot. The realization of what the stench was hit me then. Some sick individual, for whatever reason, was depositing cats in the attic, turning the place into a makeshift cemetery. My stomach turned, and before I could even realize it, I doubled over at the horror of the situation overwhelming my senses. Jamie's voice called out to me, his concern piercing through the shock. I stumbled down the ladder, words tumbling out incoherently about what I'd seen. Jamie's eyes got wide as I described the scene, and we began to run. We flew back through the back door, and didn't stop until we reached the safety of my driveway. Catching our breath, Jamie managed to mutter out what we had both realized, that someone had been using that attic for something incredibly sick. The one carcass, not yet fully decayed, indicated that it was a recent addition. We never set foot in that house again. For months I wouldn't even talk about it. The thought alone gave me nightmares. When the bulldozers came years later to tear it down, I felt a shiver of relief mixed with an inexplicable sadness. As the walls crumbled, I hoped that whatever pain and suffering lingered there might finally find release. We never found out who was going into that house with the cats. To this day, it's a mystery. Perhaps it's better not to know. The experience stands out as a poignant lesson from my childhood, serving as a reminder of the consequences of venturing into places where one doesn't belong. The experience was one of my most memorable, and not necessarily in a good way. Story 2. Someone or something in the school. I've always had a thing for abandoned places. That's what drew me and my best friend Adam to an old school on the outskirts of town. It was a massive, desolate structure, its windows boarded up, its doors sealed shut. It sat there for years, decrepit and beaten down by the elements and time. We'd been planning our little expedition for weeks. The challenge was half the fun, finding a way into a place that seemed to resist outsiders. We finally found our way in, though, through a precarious combination of climbing a pipe and a fire escape, which led to an accessible window on the roof. The inside of the school was like a time capsule. Desks coated in dust, faded posters on the walls, and rusty lockers that stood open. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating creepy dust particles that floated in the air. We explored many different areas: the main office, cafeteria, all the hallways, and many classrooms. As we made our way down to the basement, we could see that it was partially flooded. It was an eerie sight, seeing the staircase disappear into murky water, like a path leading straight into the abyss. Who knows what lay beneath its surface? Moving on, we made our way over to the gym. The once vibrant room, filled with activity, was now a shell of its former glory. Dust lay thick on benches, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The nets on the basketball goals were torn and tattered, and one of the hoops lay on the ground, as if someone had purposely torn it down at one point. The air was heavy with the musk of mold and disuse, and each step on the wooden floor creaked as if it had already reached its breaking point years ago. The atmosphere was thick and heavy, and after a rather short inspection, Adam and I decided that it was time to move on. As we began to make our way out, though, the both of us froze with a sound coming from a distance. Footsteps. It was unmistakable. They sounded methodical, purposeful, stopping occasionally as if listening. The realization that we weren't alone, that someone else was wandering these forgotten halls, threw us into a panic. Perhaps what scared us the most at the time was the fact that the footsteps seemed to be from a single person, not a group like us. It sounds weird, I know, but our thinking was that if we had heard more than one set of footprints, maybe it could have been some other kids wandering around. But for someone to come into this desolate place alone, in the middle of the night, to us that was more terrifying. More pressing, though, was the fact that the person seemed to be looking and listening for us, and the sound of the person's footsteps was coming in the direction of our exit. The only other way out was through doors that were boarded up, an impossible escape. We waited, hearts pounding, for the footsteps to stop. When they finally did, we made our move. We crept across the gym, our sneakers squeaking softly against the dusty floor. Peering down the hallway, we saw no one. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, expecting a shadow to dart across the beam of our flashlights. We made our way to the stairs, aiming to get back to the roof. It was then that we heard a sudden burst of sprinting footsteps behind us. They were fast, furious, and they were closing in. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows, we saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the echoing sound of someone, or something, chasing us. Adrenaline kicked in. We bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. "Hurry!" Adam yelled out. "You gotta move faster!" The sound of our pursuers' footsteps seemed to get closer and closer. The both of us did everything we could to move as fast as possible, and we didn't stop until we reached the 4th floor. There, we paused, panting, listening for any sound. But the sounds had mysteriously disappeared. There was nothing, just the silence of the abandoned school. We clambered out the window, our escape route, and made our way back down the pipe. Once we were safely on the ground, we ran as fast as we could. When we felt like we had made it out to a safe distance, we stopped and looked back at the looming structure. It stood there, dark and silent. We expected to see a person or a flashlight or something, but there was nothing. The walk home was hurried and quiet. I guess at the time, we were both trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was another explorer, or perhaps just our imagination running wild in the eerie setting. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something inexplicable, something that defied logic. Since then, I've passed by the old school a few times. It stands there, unchanged, its windows still boarded, its doors still sealed. I always quicken my pace when I walk by, avoiding looking at it directly. I can't help but feel that something watches from behind those boarded windows, something that remembers our visit. I think whoever it was, or whatever it was, I guess I should say, just wanted us to leave and never come back. Whatever the case may be, the wish was granted and we never went onto those grounds ever again. Story 3. The Bell Tower. Many years ago, my friends and I, always hungry for adventure, decided to explore an old building that sat just on the edge of town. It was one of those places that looked like it had a deep history, and many stories that it could tell. People said it had a hive of tragic deaths back in its heyday, around the early 1900s. Even in the 80s, strange things happened to people around the property. Then it just sat there, untouched through the 90s, like a time capsule waiting to be opened. Being young and dumb naturally, we were drawn to it. We found our way in on a whim, late one summer night. There were 6 of us, but in the end, 3 of our friends decided not to go at the last minute. Nevertheless, 2 other friends and I decided to check it out. The building was massive, an ancient behemoth with countless rooms and corridors. It felt like wandering through a maze. The deeper we ventured, the more we felt the weight of unseen eyes watching us, as if the very walls were alive with the memories of the past. Our exploration took us all the way to the top, an old bell tower room with windows that offered a panoramic, albeit grim, view of the town. It was a decent-sized room, not terribly large, but not terribly small either. It was around 1 a.m., and the world outside seemed asleep, oblivious to our little adventure. As we mingled amongst ourselves, cracking jokes and poking fun with one another, the mood shifted quickly when we began to hear sounds, like faint talking coming from below, on the 2nd floor. We froze. Our first thought was the police. Maybe someone from the neighboring building saw us sneaking in. We weren't exactly supposed to be there. In a panic, we scurried to find a hiding spot, but there was nowhere to go. Peeking through a crack in the floorboards, we saw lights making their way up the stairs, approaching steadily. Our hearts were racing, thudding so loud I was sure that they could hear us. There was nowhere to go and nowhere to hide. But just as we thought that we were about to be caught, something strange happened. The lights disappeared. In an instant, they had vanished. After a while, and not knowing what else to do, we slowly crept over towards the stairs, moving as silently as we could. Though the lights were gone, in the distance, we could hear faint voices. We rationalized to ourselves that if it were the police, they would have made calls for us, and they would have certainly searched the bell tower. It was then that it dawned on us that it was probably our friends, the 3 that had bailed on us at the last minute. Without giving it much else thought, we settled on that assumption and decided to make an effort to scare them. Gathering our courage, we tiptoed down the creaking stairs. The voices grew louder, more distinct, as if a group of people was gathered in the large room at the end of the hallway. Our plan was straightforward: burst into the room and give them the scare of their lives. As we approached the entrance, we could definitely make out voices, clear as day. We looked at each other, exchanging nods, and with one synchronized motion, we burst into the room and yelled out, "Hey!" But the room was empty. There was nothing. No one. It was impossible. The voices were so clear, but there was not a soul in sight. The laughter died in our throats, and the voices we were hearing came to an abrupt stop. The only sound in that moment was our ragged breathing. We stood there frozen as the realization dawned on us. The talking, the lights, the presence we felt. It wasn't our friends. It was something else. Deciding not to stick around to find out what, we bolted out of that room and out of the building. We ran as fast as our feet could take us. Once we were a safe distance away, we stopped, panting and laughing nervously. The laughter was a mask, something to cover the fear that we were all feeling. As the three of us stood there in the warm night air, our laughter slowly faded into an eerie silence. We exchanged glances, each of us wrestling with the same unspoken question. What in the hell did we just encounter? In the days that followed, our adventure at the bell tower became the talk of our little circle. Some of our friends were skeptical, others were curious, but none dared to venture into the building to validate our story. As time passed, the intensity of that night began to wane in our memories, but it never completely disappeared. Years rolled by, and we all grew up, moving on with our lives. Yet every now and then, when we'd get together, someone would inevitably bring up that night. It was our shared, unexplainable experience, a brush with something beyond our understanding. Decades later, the town decided to demolish the old building to make way for new development. Watching the news footage of the demolition, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. That building, with all its mysteries and secrets, was a link to our youth, to a time when the world seemed bigger and more mysterious. As the bell tower crumbled to the ground, I like to think that whatever energies that were trapped there were finally released, free to move on. In the end, the bell tower remained an enigma, a shadowy figure in the backdrop of our coming-of-age story. Its true history and the source of those eerie occurrences that night were never uncovered, but it left us with a lasting lesson. There are mysteries in this world that are beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's better to leave them as they are. Story 4. The Warehouse. I had just turned 19 years old when this happened. It was one of those hot, sticky weekend nights where you're with your friends looking for something stupid to do. Jay, the oldest in the group, suggested we head out to the old warehouse outside of town. I remember that there were 4 of us, and we all piled into Joey's car. If I had known then what I was about to see, I would have never gone. It would end up being the most terrifying night of my life. Driving down those back roads, it was just laughs and the wind through the windows. But as we got closer, you could feel the mood shift. The warehouse wasn't some spooky place from local legends or anything. It was just old, abandoned, and useless. But standing there in the moonlight, it looked like the setting of a horror movie. We parked under a tree, and as we started walking, I remember how eerie it was. It was so still and quiet. All we could hear was our own footsteps on the gravel. As we approached, we could see some lights in the warehouse. Not the strong, steady lights of flashlights or lamps, but this weak, sort of flickering glow. It was coming from inside, and it was creepy as hell. But being young and dumb, we thought we were invincible. So we crept up to the building, trying to get a peek through those old dirty windows. We couldn't see much, but there were definitely people in there. We should have left right then and there, but of course we didn't. We found a door and it wasn't locked, so we carefully slid in, trying not to make any noise. The inside of that place smelled like rust and old rainwater. We slowly tiptoed towards the direction of the lights and hid behind some hunk of machinery. I couldn't tell you what type of machinery it was, but it was perfect for concealing us while we got a look at what was going on inside. There were men. It looked like 6 of them, all wearing these strange robes with hoods, standing around in a circle. They had candles, and the light was throwing these huge, monstrous shadows all over the walls. It was beyond creepy. They had drawn something on the floor. We couldn't see what it was, but it looked to be ritualistic, I guess is the best way to put it. The air was just filled with this mumbling chant they were all doing together. You could tell that the mood in our group went from one of curiosity to pure terror and dread very quickly. As we looked on, suddenly it became quiet. The mumbling stopped and the men paused for a second. Then, one of the robed guys went over to this nearby table. There was a black sheet over something that looked like a box. When the man removed the sheet, we could see that it was a cage, and it had a rabbit inside. The man picked it up and walked towards the center of the circle as the other men began this wailing chant. And that's when my friend Jason lost it. I remember him backing up and muttering, "We gotta go, we gotta go." We tried to hush him, but the damage was done. We'd made too much noise. The guys in the circle heard us, stopped their chanting, and turned our way. I know that I can speak for the rest of the guys when I say that in that exact moment, each of us was the most terrified we'd ever been in our lives. We were made, and we weren't going to waste any more time. I don't think I've ever run as fast as I did out of that place. We bolted back to the car, screaming in a panic over what we just saw and what we believed was about to happen. Joey started the car, and we tore out of there, not stopping or looking back. We didn't talk about it much after that night, to be honest. It was like speaking it out loud might bring some part of that darkness into our normal lives. But I'll tell you what, that night has stayed with me. That feeling of something unholy happening just a few feet away. I've never seen anything like it. And I'll never put myself in a position to see anything like it ever again. Story 5. Abandoned Shelter. I've always been a runner. There's something about the rhythm of my feet hitting the trail, the steady breaths, and the beat of my heart in my ears that brings a sense of peace. Time stands still, and the world around me blurs. I've been running the same trail for months, ever since I moved to this part of town. It's a picturesque run, with woods that change with the seasons, fields that stretch wide, and in the distance, and on one part of the trail, an old abandoned barn. It's become a fixture of my runs, a landmark I look forward to. One autumn afternoon, I set off on my usual route. The air was crisp, and the sky seemed clear. I should have known better. I should have paid more attention to the weather report. Halfway through my run, just as I was approaching the part of the trail where the barn could be seen, the sky opened up. Rain poured in sheets, and thunder began to hammer. Cursing my luck and my lack of observation, I realized I was miles from home with no real shelter in sight except the barn. It wasn't ideal, but it beat getting drenched and risking a cold or worse. Squinting through the downpour, I made my way across the field toward the silhouette of the barn. Inside, it was as you'd expect, dilapidated, run down, and beat up. You could tell that it had done everything that it could to fend off the elements for many years, but could barely fend off any more of Mother Nature's abuse. Rain drummed on the roof, occasionally sneaking through holes and cracks, creating thin waterfalls. Regardless, it was marginally better than the alternative. As I waited, hoping the storm would pass quickly, I glanced around, and my eyes were drawn to the loft area above. Curiosity poked at me, and I decided to take a look, if only to pass the time. What I found wasn't the emptiness I expected. There were belongings scattered around, a ratty blanket, plastic bags, bits of food wrappers, and a water bottle. It wasn't old debris. Someone was staying here. As I looked around, something caught my eye through one of the grimy windows. It was a figure moving through the field in the storm towards the barn. It was difficult to make out details, but the movement was purposeful, direct. My heart picked up pace a little bit as I realized that I was about to have an encounter with someone. I descended the ladder and turned around just in time to see a man burst through the barn's weak door. His appearance was messy, clothes in tatters, a wild beard, but it was his eyes that caught me. They were wide, almost bulging. The whites of his eyes were such a glaring contrast against the dirt of his skin. I raised my hands, trying to project out a friendly greeting. I stammered out that I was just seeking shelter from the storm, but my words seemed to ricochet off him. His look was one of surprise at first, but quickly turned to anger. Out of nowhere he began to scream. It was so loud, violent, and piercing that I thought it would bring down the entire barn. I was taken off guard. I didn't know what to expect from the encounter, but I sure as hell didn't expect this. He jumped up and down and swung his arms erratically as he screamed, "Get out! Get out!" I didn't need to be told twice. I hurried my way out. My eyes were glued to him as I dodged around him. Forgetting the rain and the risk of illness, I bolted. I chose the storm's violence over his, and I ran, slipping and sliding in the mud until the barn was far behind me. The experience stuck with me for a while. It was intense, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I thought about calling the cops, but something held me back. That barn, at the end of the day, was his home. It wasn't much, but it was his. Who was I to take that away? Aside from that, I was technically trespassing, even if I was just trying to seek shelter. Weighing those two factors, I decided to just let it be. I continue my runs, as steadfast in that routine as ever. But now, when I pass the spot where the barn rises in the distance, I'll be honest. My pace involuntarily picks up, and I can't help but have a little bit more heightened awareness about my surroundings. As for the man, I have no ill will towards him. If he's still there in that barn, I hope he's doing well. If he's not, if he's moved on, I hope he's doing well wherever he may be. Story 6. The Hendersons' Abandoned Farm. When you're 18, invincible feeling and constantly egged on by similarly fearless friends, you do stupid stuff. For me, the epitome of said stupidity was accepting a dare to explore the old, crumbled-down Henderson farm. Everyone in town knew of it, and as teenagers, it was sort of this unspoken test of courage none of us could back down from. That's how, armed with nothing but my phone, a flashlight, and the kind of confidence only ignorance can give you, I found myself standing at the property's rusted gate just as the sun was setting. The whole scene was like something straight out of a horror movie, and I remember joking to myself, trying to ease the knot of genuine fear building in my chest. The Henderson farm had been abandoned for ages. The story around town was that the family had hit tough times, or maybe it was some dark secret forcing them to just up and leave. Whatever the cause, they left their home to rot, and over the years, it became a local attraction for teenagers, such as myself, after nightfall. There were rumors that weird things went on in the cellar of that farm, and I wanted to find out for myself. Walking up to the house, I was hyper-aware of every sound. Every broken twig under my sneakers seemed to echo through the empty woods around the property. The house itself was a mess, all peeling paint, and windows like black holes. I had to force myself to remember it was just an old building, nothing more. Inside, things went from cliché to downright eerie. There was this stillness in the air, the kind of heavy quiet you don't get in town. Dust covered everything, and it was clear from the footprints that I wasn't the first idiot to take on the dare. The place was frightening, to say the least, but the real fear didn't set in until I found the door to the cellar. It was this eerie old thing that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. My friend Jamie had been very specific. The dare's not done until you've seen the cellar. No one goes down there, so bring back pictures to prove that you were. Now, staring at the door, the reality of why no one ventured further hit me hard. Something felt very wrong, but the taunts of being labeled a coward kept me moving forward. The air turned colder the moment I stepped onto the top of the stairs. It smelled like wet dirt and something rotten, and it took every ounce of my will to start descending. The stairs felt like they were going to give way under my weight. I kept a tight grip on my flashlight as I slowly took one step, after another, after another. What I found below didn't make sense at first. It was like a scene from some messed-up horror flick. There were cages everywhere, rusty, broken cages, and others still eerily intact, and bones. Not big ones, but like rabbits or maybe even cats and small dogs. It dawned on me slowly, a nauseating realization. Someone had kept animals trapped down here, forgotten and left to die horrific, lonely deaths. That's when I heard the scratching, this skittering sound close by. Rats, I told myself. Big, nasty rats, nothing more. But I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched, like there were eyes out there in the corners my flashlight couldn't reach. My heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest, and a cold sweat glued my shirt to my back. I reached for my phone. If I didn't take any pictures, I'd never hear the end of it. Just as I was about to pull it out of my pocket, there was a slight movement in the corner of the room, and then a loud bang. That was it for me. I was done. I peeled out of there so fast, It was almost as if I levitated up the stairs. The next thing I knew, I was gasping for air at the edge of the property. Jamie and another friend were waiting on me. "What happened? What happened?" they asked. As I caught my breath, I did my best to relay what I saw and what happened. "Did you get pictures?" they asked. "No, man, I got the hell out of there." Their looks were ones of disappointment, but at the same time, I believed the terror on my face conveyed that I was being truthful. About a year later, the farm was taken over by new ownership, and the cellar, along with everything else that was falling apart, was taken down to make way for the new. If you asked me today whether or not I thought the place was haunted, I would probably lean towards no. That movement in the corner and the bang that followed, who knows? It could have just been a rat or something. Either way, it was a terrifying experience and one that I'll carry with me for years to come. Story 7. The Old Barn. I was 20 then, but now pushing 30, those wild days seem like a lifetime ago. It's funny how some memories fade while others cling to your mind like burrs. This particular memory, it's one of those that prick me every now and again, especially when I drive past an old rundown structure that should have been demolished years ago. My friends and I were kids in a nowhere town. We were tight. We had the kind of friendship that only small towns can forge, bound together by a shared craving for anything that could break the monotony of our days. I guess you could say that my friend Kyle was the ringleader, always cooking up schemes that teetered on the edge of trouble. He had heard about an abandoned barn a few miles outside of town. Said he'd heard from his old man that weird, creepy things happen out at that barn. Supposedly a man caught his wife with another man in that barn years ago. Some say he buried them both under the floorboards, I remember Kyle saying. It wasn't true. Nobody was buried out there and there weren't any ghosts. But I knew about the place that he was talking about, and I couldn't deny that there was certainly something creepy about it. Nevertheless, it was something to do, and we were young and craving adventure. So 3 of us found our way into Kyle's truck heading out to the old barn. The road was more holes than dirt, a bumpy ride that had us being tossed against each other, laughing and swearing the whole way. We parked a ways off where we could see the barn in the distance. The light of a full moon gave it that extra touch of eeriness. "Just in case we gotta make a quick exit," Kyle said, winking. We piled out and began making our way across the field to the barn. The barn was way bigger up close. Among the 3 of us, we had one flashlight, which I was lucky enough to carry. Upon entering, the smell was the first thing that hit us. It was a thick, overpowering stench of decay. That should have been our warning to turn around and leave, but again, we were very young at the time and not very bright. As we crept in, my flashlight scanned around the interior. The place was dilapidated. It felt like it was over 100 years old. It was barely being held up by rotting wood and honestly, probably could have fallen apart at any moment. We didn't care though. We thought we were invincible, so we pressed on. As we neared the center of the structure, I remember pausing, feeling a cold certainty that eyes were tracking our every move. "I think we're being watched," I whispered, hearing the unease in my own voice. "Probably just some field mice, man," our other friend Matt said. But nobody believed it. All 3 of us felt like we had eyes on us. We edged further in, past remains of someone's past life on a farm. There was a rusted plow, broken stalls, and a tractor seat covered in bird droppings. What we would find at the very back, though, certainly didn't belong to a farmer from past decades. As we inched closer and closer towards the back, the initial stench we had caught wind of when we first entered intensified more and more. As the beam of my flashlight traced down from the back wall onto the floor, we found the source of the stench. There were 2 raccoons and 2 squirrels, together, lifeless and rotting. Their bodies were arranged in a chillingly organized line. It was grotesque, the way they lay there together, and it was clear that they hadn't just wandered in and died. "We should get out of here," I remember saying, the smell making my stomach churn. My suggestion was just an instant too late, though. As I whispered out the words, a soft thud came from the front of the barn, where we had entered. It wasn't very loud, but in the silence of the night, standing in front of what we were looking at, It might as well have been as loud as a crack from a firecracker. It was enough to cause me to drop my flashlight as we all three spun around. As the flashlight landed, its beam of light shot out towards the front of the barn. In doing so, it briefly illuminated a figure, dressed in all black, moving in the darkness. We didn't scream, didn't say a word. We ran, pure instinct, scrambling towards a window, and flew out of the barn. For the three of us, it was probably the fastest that each of us had ever ran before in our lives. By the time we got back to the truck, I remember my lungs burning as they sucked in the cold air from the night. Each of us were frantic as we drove back into town. As we pulled into Matt's place, we had finally calmed down some. We were exhausted, most likely from the adrenaline dump from the events of the night. We gathered ourselves and talked about what we had just been through for a bit before passing out. It had been a long night. Kyle took the spare bedroom, and I passed out on the couch. At the time, we had no idea that we were in for one last surprise. Come morning, Kyle was the first one out the door. Within a few seconds, he darted back in. "There's a dead raccoon in the back of my truck," he said, his eyes gaping wide. "What?" I said. "You heard me. There's a dead raccoon in the back of my truck," he shot back. He wasn't making it up. We all three went to investigate, and sure enough, there it was. "Was it there when we left the barn last night?" Matt asked. Kyle and I looked at each other. We had no idea. It was an important question. Was the creepy person able to follow us out? If so, then he knew where Matt lived. If not, if it had been placed there while we were parked down from the barn, then it probably served as nothing more than a warning. Looking back, years later, it was most undoubtedly a warning. Nothing else ever came of the barn or the creepy figure inside of it. It was a terrifying night for the three of us, one that I don't think any of us will ever forget. Every now and then, one of us will bring up the story. It's something we kind of laugh about now. Back then, however, it was certainly one of the most terrifying things that each of us had experienced in our younger years. Story 8. Something upstairs. When I was 18, like most kids, I thought I was invincible. You know how it is at that age. Cliff and John were my partners in crime, always up for a challenge, always seeking the next big adrenaline rush. That day, we decided to explore this abandoned house, not too far from the center of our little town. It was a creepy house that most sane people would avoid at all costs. But not us. At least, not on that day. The house was an old, abandoned structure that had been left for dead many years ago. It was a 2-story house with an overgrown lawn and broken-out windows. Its wooden panels were all warped and rotten, and it had gaping holes that stared right back at you. It was the perfect setting for one of those horror movies we used to watch. But to us, it looked like our next adventure. Not having the courage to go at night, we ventured out to the place on a lazy Saturday afternoon. Of the three of us, Cliff seemed to be the most uneasy about it. "We're going to get caught," I remember him saying, but John and I just laughed it off. "Relax," I told him. "Nobody goes down this road." I remember being pretty good about making everyone feel like everything was going to be fine, even if I didn't know for sure. As we parked and got out of the car, we looked around. Just as I had hoped, there was nobody in sight. Stepping inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in debris, and every step we took kicked up clouds of dust. There was no back door, just a gaping hole where a door should have been. You could see footprints in the dust on the floor. We weren't the first adventurers to wander into this place. It looked like it had been a while, though. You could tell by the amount of dust that had begun to fall back over the footprints. There were other prints as well, non-human. It looked like a large dog, probably a stray that had been wandering around in here at some point too. Those looked more recent. As we made our way around, I swore that I began to hear some rustling coming from upstairs. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked. "Yeah, I do," Cliff said. "Maybe we should go." Before he could finish his thought, though, John was already heading up the stairs. "Are you kidding me?" I said. John replied back, "We're already here, we might as well check it out." In my head, I remember thinking to myself that the noise was our cue to leave, not investigate. But that was John. He was always doing things like that. He was a take action before thinking about it type of guy. Reluctantly, Cliff and I followed his lead. As we reached the top of the stairs, the rustling stopped, almost like it sensed us coming. There were 3 doors. One looked to be the entrance to a bathroom, while the other 2 looked to be entrances to bedrooms. There, we took a moment to decide which door we were going to investigate first. But the decision had already been made. From the first bedroom, we heard a low, guttural growl. In my mind, it was definitely time to leave. Now. But once again, John took action without thinking. He slowly crept over and peeked his head into the already open door. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. Cliff and I, rather than asking him what it was, leaned in to get a look for ourselves. There, in the corner of the room, was a dog. But not like any dog I'd ever seen. This thing was massive, its fur matted and dirty. Its eyes were wild with aggression. Its lip was curled, exposing its dagger-like canines, and its hackles were standing straight up. For a split second, I thought back to the paw prints downstairs. A dog hadn't been there. A dog was there. What a huge difference. It was growling at a fever pitch now, and we were frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, it let out a loud, reverberating bark. The sound of it shook the entire room. At this moment, we did the one thing we shouldn't have done. We ran. Everyone knows that running typically triggers an aggressive animal's natural instincts. Nevertheless, it's what we did. It lunged at us, barking and snapping its jaws. We turned and ran down the stairs. All I remember was running as fast as my legs could take me, doing everything I could to put distance in between the canine and me without falling and breaking my neck. John was in the back, and he was screaming as loud as he could for us to move faster. We could almost feel the breath of this thing spilling over our backs. None of us looked behind us as we burst out of the front door. Each of us lunged for the car, frantically pulling at the handles to open the doors. Safely inside, we peeled away, never to return to that place again. It was a terrifying experience that none of us have ever forgotten. Any of us could have been seriously injured or worse if that dog had managed to clamp its jaws around one of us. Speeding away in the safety of the car, the reality of what had just happened hit us. We were shaking and laughing nervously. It was a close call. Too close. I don't blame the dog for trying to defend itself, though. It had probably been a stray for a long time and had many encounters. At the end of the day, we had cornered it, even if it was unintentional. I learned my lesson that day, and it was the last day that I ever stepped foot into any kind of abandoned structure. Sometimes you wander into places and find nothing. Other times you find more than what you bargained for. Story 9. School's Out. I'll never forget that night when I was 19. The night when boredom led my friend Josh and me down a path we'd come to regret. It was one of those evenings that stretched out like a road to nowhere. We were lounging around in Josh's cramped apartment, flipping through channels, dismissing every form of digital entertainment when the idea struck. Let's check out the abandoned school a few blocks away. We'd been there before during daylight, poking around the decrepit classrooms and the musty gym. It was unsettling even then, but the cover of dark, we figured, would drape it in a whole new level of eerie. So just after 1 a.m., with the streets quiet and the world asleep, we ventured out. It was autumn, and the air was cool as we cut through the woods on our walk to the school. The school was a hulking silhouette in the night. Its broken windows looked like jagged teeth in a gaping mouth. As we slipped inside, the beam of our flashlights revealed the havoc wreaked by time and neglect. Graffiti was scrawled across walls, trash littered the floors, and the pungent stench of mold filled the air. We meandered through the gym. Its once polished floor now just looked like a canvas of decay. The cafeteria, which once held the laughter of hundreds of children, now only held silence. It was fascinating in a grim sort of way, this glimpse into a place that was once brimming with life. But as the novelty wore off and our amusement faded, we decided we'd had enough thrills for one night. We were about to head out when a noise echoed from down a hallway, a crash that ricocheted off the walls. I tried to dismiss it as an animal or some stray cat or something, but Josh, ever the curious one, wouldn't have it. He was convinced it was something more. "Let's just check it out," he insisted. We went lights off and crept toward the sound. As we got closer, we heard voices, gruff and low, definitely not animals. We inched closer, and that's when we saw a flashlight's beam bouncing off the metal of a locker. Peeking around the corner, we strained to see what they were doing. There were two men, and they looked tall and menacing. It looked like they were trying to pry open a jammed locker. One man held a flashlight while the other wrestled with it. "Keep it quiet," the man with the flashlight said. "You want to do this?" the other man replied. "What are they doing?" Josh whispered over to me. But before I could answer, the beam of light from the man's flashlight hit both of us square in our faces. "What the hell?" a voice growled. Panic seized us, instinct took over, and we ran. We sprinted down the hallway, doing our best not to stumble over the debris on the floor. The men pursued us, their footsteps sounding like gunshots coming down the dark hall. Bursting from the school's entrance, we dashed for the woods as fast as we could go. Amidst the chaos, I took a quick look over my shoulder to see that the men were still in pursuit. Fear and shock tore through Josh and me as we finally reached the woods and began to tear through them. Twigs snapped under our feet, and branches clawed at our clothes. The men's shouts faded as we made our way deeper and deeper into the woods. Taking a moment to finally catch our breath, we turned to look and caught sight of the men's flashlights stopping at the wood line. They were either deterred by the thought of getting lost, or simply decided that we weren't worth the trouble. For us, we didn't care. They had stopped their pursuit, and that's all that mattered. Not wanting to press our luck, Josh and I continued until we finally reached his apartment. Once inside, we were an absolute mess. We were panting, sweating, and shaking. We never returned to the school. I guess the fear of crossing paths with those men again kept us away. I always wondered what was in that locker, though. Was it money? Maybe drugs? Or something else? Whatever it was, those men didn't want us to know about it. That abandoned school, once a sanctuary for hundreds of children, now holds, it seems, a little bit more than just a few stories from the past. Story 10. Mystery locked in the abandoned Elmwood house. I was 16 when the veil of childhood wonder was brutally torn away by the grim reality of what my friends and I found in the Elmwood house. Now, at 33, I can still remember that day like it was yesterday. Connor, April, and I, we were inseparable back then, a trio against the world. The neighborhood was our kingdom, but within it, there stood a creepy house at the end of the street. The old couple, Mr. and Mrs. Elmwood, were like characters from a scary Disney story, mysterious and rarely seen. After Mr. Elmwood passed, Mrs. Elmwood's mind seemed to unravel. She'd wander out at strange hours. She seemed to talk to herself while aimlessly pacing around in the yard, and on a few occasions was seen standing motionless in her front window, just staring out into the street. She rarely got visitors, and when they came, they often didn't stay long. Parents in the neighborhood warned their kids to steer clear of her in the house, and we obliged, not out of respect, but more out of a bone-deep fear. Time marched on, and eventually Mrs. Elmwood passed on as well, leaving the house abandoned, with nature slowly reclaiming it, and the small yard surrounding it. Despite years of caution, the mystery of the old house eventually became too tempting. One afternoon, bored and overflowing with teenage fearlessness, Connor, April, and I crossed that unspoken boundary and stepped into what remained of the Elmwood home. Sneaking in through what was left of the back door, immediately April wanted to leave. With some reassurance, however, Connor and I were able to convince her to continue. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the dust of forgotten years. The wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing the crumbling plaster beneath, and cobwebs clung to every corner of the dilapidated house. In one room, the ceiling had sprung a leak and caved in after many years of decay. In another room, however, there was something far more interesting. There was a particular closet, stubbornly sealed, like it was keeping the darkest secrets of the house. We tried our best to get it open, but it wouldn't budge. After putting forth our best attempt to open it, we finally gave up for the day and left. Days later, still haunted by that locked closet, we decided to break it open. The idea of going at night seemed more exciting, more challenging, I guess you could say. In hindsight, it was foolish. The darkness did things to the Elmwood house. It transformed it. Gone was the benign neglect of the daylight, replaced by an ominous, foreboding aura that made our skin crawl and set our hearts pounding. We arrived armed with flashlights and the kind of determination that only the ignorance of youth can inspire. That closet was like a beacon calling us to it. We had to know what was inside. It was Connor who took the lead, his foot connecting with the door in a solid thud. The sound of his blow reverberated through the house, bouncing off the walls and coming back to us like it was amplified. "I don't like this," April said, with an unmistakable tremble in her voice. Ignoring her, Connor kicked it again. He delivered blow after blow, his resolve never waning, until finally the lock could hold no longer and gave way in a climactic burst. Connor and I postured for the best handle we could get on the door and jerked on it, finally slinging it open. As we shone our flashlights in, it took us a few seconds to get a handle on what it was that we were looking at. Upon realization, April screamed and stumbled backwards. Without a second thought, she turned and sprinted towards the back door. Connor, usually the bravest of us, yelled out, "Oh my God!" and stumbled back as well. As for me, I was frozen in place, terrified and eyes wide open, trying to process what I was looking at. Inside, there were 4 large shelves. Each of them was filled with dozens of jars. Inside the jars were animal parts, suspended in preserving liquid, gazing out at us. A pig's foot here, chicken feet there, and a jar of what looked like eyeballs that seemed to follow our every move. It was the most terrifying and grotesque thing that any of us had ever seen in our young lives. "I'm done," Connor yelled out. "I'm done, man. I'm leaving." He wasn't alone. I was done too, and we left immediately. The following days were a mess. April didn't want to talk to us. Connor ignored the subject, and I couldn't shake the vision of that closet out of my head. Eventually, we all 3 came around and decided not to bring it up again, and not to tell anybody what we did or what happened. After all, we were trespassing. The house was eventually taken over by someone with no knowledge of its past, and renovated into a sterile shadow of its former self. I guess it's safe to assume that the contents of the closet were found and disposed of properly. Connor, April, and I moved on, but the bond of that night and the fear stayed with us. Now, years later, whenever I go to visit my parents, I always sneak a look down to the end of the street where the Elmwood house once stood. I can't help but think about that night and some of the questions that will forever linger in my head. What in the hell were those jars doing in there? What purpose did they serve, and where did the animal parts come from? It seems that the answers, unfortunately, will forever be kept with Mr. and Mrs. Elmwood. Story 11. That one abandoned shack across the street and over the hill. When I was a kid, I lived just outside the city, surrounded by beautiful sprawling woods all around. I loved living in the woods, and my friend Ted, who lived down the gravel road, was my partner in crime, my fellow adventurer in the great outdoors that was our backyard. He would often make his way over, and at some point, we would find ourselves in the woods, using sticks for swords, or climbing a little bit too high in some of the trees. One sunny afternoon, my dad came out, keys in hand, and said he and my mom were heading into town to run some errands. His eyes met mine, stern and unwavering, as he reminded me of the one rule that had always stood: play in the woods behind our house, but never cross the street to the woods over the hill. I nodded, the image of obedience as they drove away. The moment their car disappeared, a rebellious spark ignited within me. "Ted," I said, "do you want to know why we can't go across the street?" His eyes perked up a little bit as he turned and looked at me. "I don't know. Why?" he asked. I looked back at him with a devious smile on my face and said, "I don't know either, but there's only one way to find out." Ted hesitated, reminding me of my dad's warning, but curiosity is a powerful thing, and soon we were sneaking across the street, our hearts pounding with the thrill of the forbidden. At first, the woods didn't look any different from what was out behind my house, but as we ventured deeper in, they seemed to grow quieter and darker, as if an ominous cloud was lingering above, blocking out the sun's beautiful rays. Ted, feeling the unease, suggested we turn back, but I wasn't ready to give up on the mystery. We wandered deeper and deeper. Finally, just as we were about to give up and head home, something in the distance caught my eye, a shape that didn't belong. It was an abandoned shack, decrepit and eerie, with broken-out windows and exterior walls that were barely holding together. Ted wanted to leave, but there was something about the shack that called me in, like a moth to a flame. "Just a quick look," I promised, and we approached the opening slowly and cautiously. There was only a board for a door, and we slid it to the side pretty easily. Inside, the floor was just dirt. On the interior walls, though, were what looked to be some type of ritualistic symbols and markings that made the hairs on my neck stand up. In the center, the earth looked disturbed, as if hiding a secret just beneath its surface. Without thinking, we knelt down and began to dig with our hands, slowly at first, but then faster and faster as the ground began to give way to whatever it was hiding. Eventually, its holdings came into clear view. What we found sent us both into shock. A large bone from a leg. Ted, wide-eyed and pale, looked at me slowly and whispered, "I think this is human." Panic surged through me, and we jumped up and fled the shack as if the devil himself were on our heels. As we ran, a movement caught my eye, a shadowy figure lurking behind some brush in the distance. I told Ted, but we didn't stop, and didn't look back until we were safe at home, chests heaving, our minds racing with fear. We argued about whether or not to tell my dad, but as his car pulled up, the truth spilled out. I told my dad everything, the shack, the bone, the figure. He wasn't happy, but he listened, his face turning serious as he dialed the sheriff. What followed was a blur of blue uniforms and flashing lights. Night settled in as multiple officers made their way back towards the abandoned shack. As the officers conducted their thorough investigation, sifting through the evidence with a mix of apprehension and professionalism, they did indeed uncover a collection of bones. Initially, there was a wave of concern at the possibility of human remains being found. However, after careful examination, it was determined that the bones were not human. Instead, they belonged to various animals, suggesting a different, though still unsettling, use of the shack. Still, it was no place for kids, and after a few short days, it was torn down. I wasn't punished, not really. My dad said the scare we got was punishment enough, and I had done the right thing by coming clean. As for the mysterious figure, looking back, I think it was probably just a figment of my imagination, something I conjured up in my head in the panic of the moment. We never saw anybody come around, and whoever it was that was using the shack was never found. Not that I believe that anybody was actually looking for him or her or whoever. The ordeal was terrifying and a lesson hard learned. I understood then, perhaps for the first time, the wisdom in my father's words and the protection in his rules. Though the shack is long gone, the memory of that day is ingrained in my mind. Many years later, Ted and I are still friends, and often bring up the story about that one abandoned shack, across the street and over the hill. Story 12. You know what this is. I'd been a pizza delivery person for about a year and a half, and had seen my fair share of odd delivery locations. Most deliveries, though, were standard. A delivery to a house, a place of business, places of that nature. One night, though, I took an order I'll never forget. It was the scariest situation I'd ever been through, and I learned a tough lesson that day. Orders that day were pretty straightforward, but as evening turned into night, I received one that, at least for me, was pretty unusual. I was to deliver to an address that turned out to be an old, abandoned building. The customer had left a note, saying the place was under new ownership and about to be renovated. The man would be working through the night and needed the pizza delivered to the address. I shrugged it off, thinking that the explanation sounded reasonable enough to me. As I pulled up to the building, though, something in my gut told me that something bad was going to happen. The building turned out to be an old car repair shop with multiple garage bay doors. It was dark, eerily silent, and had no lights on. The instructions were to enter through a garage door that was cracked open about 4 feet. As I sat in my car, I looked over and saw the door. Just as the instructions stated, it was cracked open. Maybe I'll just leave the pizza by the door, I thought to myself. Checking the order, though, I saw that it hadn't yet been paid for. Damn it, I said under my breath. Wanting to just get the order fulfilled and over with, I began to exit my vehicle. But as I did, something came over me. I couldn't tell you what it was, but it made me do something I'd never done before. I called my buddy Caleb. "Hey," I said to him, "I know this is weird and out of nowhere, but I got a bad feeling about this place I'm about to deliver to." I quickly explained the situation, gave him the address, and told him to call the cops if he didn't hear back from me in 5 minutes. He started bombarding me with questions, but I told him to just do it, and after he agreed, I hung up. Taking a deep breath, I left my car running, got out, and ducked under the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the vast empty space. "Yo," a voice called out from the back. "Come on over." It was a man's voice, friendly, almost too friendly. I felt a knot in my stomach tighten. "Sorry about the lights. The electricity's not fixed yet," the voice called out. I didn't buy it for a second. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I walked towards the voice, wanting to get this delivery over with. As I inched over, I could barely make out a man in the distance, standing beside what looked to be a desk. After about 8 or 10 steps, suddenly, the garage door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and saw a large silhouette blocking the only exit. A fear inside me that I had never felt was unlocked, and my heart pounded in my chest as the man slowly approached me. In his hand, he held a knife. "You know what this is," he said menacingly. He ordered me to walk towards the back of the shop, where the other man stood by a desk, barely visible from the little bit of light filtering in from the outside. They demanded my wallet and phone. Trembling, I handed them over. The guy that had been standing by the desk filtered through my wallet, angered by what little was in it. Just $2 and a debit card. $2 and a debit card? That's it? No credit cards?" he barked. I don't have any," I stammered, my body shaking like a jackhammer. The man glanced over my shoulder, in the direction of my car that was still outside running. My mind raced with fear, and I began to feel sick. "Looks like we're taking a trip to the ATM then," he said. Just then, headlights swept in from the street and into the parking lot. The men were momentarily distracted, and I seized my chance. I threw the pizza down and bolted towards the garage door, pounding on it and screaming, "It's the cops! In here! Help! Help!" I continued to pound on the door, while looking for a way to open it. The cops, alerted by Caleb, had arrived just in time. They managed to help me open the door, but the 2 men had vanished into the night. My wallet, everything in it, and my phone were left behind on the desk. I guess they didn't think the $2 and a debit card were enough to mess with. The officers checked on me, and I was a shaking mess, barely able to speak. The relief of being safe, yet the terror of what could have happened, overwhelmed me. The men did well to cover their tracks. The call to the pizza shop was made from a 68-year-old woman's phone. As she put it, she was approached by an intimidating man on the street that said the battery in his phone had died, and requested if he could use hers. She felt unnerved but relented, and as the man was finishing up his call, much to her relief, a couple rounded the corner and approached the 2. Seeing this, the man handed the phone back over and walked away. The description of the man matched the person I had seen standing over by the desk. Unfortunately, the police were never able to locate the men. There was something else that happened too. Caleb, my guardian angel that night, did something that I didn't ask him to do, and it probably saved my life. Instead of waiting 5 minutes to call the cops, he only waited about 20 seconds. "I could tell in your voice that something was really wrong," he said. That's how the cops got there so soon. Had he actually waited 5 minutes, the cops might have been too late. That was the last abandoned building I would ever take an order for. I should have known better than to try to make that delivery. Fortunately for me, though, I'll have the opportunity to not make the same mistake again.